March 21, 1944. Occupied France. The Gestapo issued a 5-million-franc bounty for the capture of one woman, Nancy Wake. She had become the most wanted person in occupied France, a woman who had defied the Nazi regime with remarkable courage, wit, and audacity. Known as the White Mouse, Wake had escaped multiple attempts on her life, sabotaged key German infrastructure, and helped lead a series of resistance missions that crippled Nazi forces. The Germans believed they were on the cusp of capturing this elusive agent, but they had underestimated her. How did one woman evade the Gestapo's relentless pursuit, disrupt key military operations, and contribute to the fall of Nazi-controlled France? This story will examine her missions, the strategic importance of her work, and the devastating blow her resistance efforts struck at the heart of the German occupation. August 30th, 1912. Roseneath, New Zealand. A girl named Nancy Grace Augusta Wake was born into a modest household, far removed from the glamorous and dangerous life she would later lead across the battlefields of occupied Europe. Her father, Charles Augustus Wake, worked as a journalist, and her mother, Ella, raised 6 children in a household that often struggled financially. The family's circumstances were typical of working-class New Zealand families in the early 20th century, marked by hard work, limited resources, and modest expectations. The family relocated to Sydney, Australia, when Nancy was still a child. The move was prompted by her father's work opportunities, though the family's financial situation remained precarious. There, she attended North Sydney Household Arts School, an institution designed to prepare young women for domestic life. But Nancy's restless spirit and desire for adventure made her unsuited for conventional domesticity. She dreamed of travel, excitement, and a life beyond the boundaries of suburban Sydney. At the age of 16, Nancy left home with just £200, an inheritance from an aunt who had recognized the young woman's independent spirit. She worked briefly as a nurse, saving money to fulfill her dream of traveling to Europe. The decision to leave was not made lightly. In the 1920s, it was uncommon for young women to travel alone, particularly to destinations as distant as Europe. But Nancy was determined. By the late 1920s, Nancy had arrived in London, where she began training as a journalist. She enrolled in courses, learned shorthand, and developed the skills necessary for a career in the news industry. London, in the late 20s, was a city of contrasts. Wealthy neighborhoods coexisted with impoverished slums, and the scars of the Great War were still visible in the faces of veterans and the monuments to the dead. Her work took her to Paris in the early 1930s. The city was alive with culture, politics, and a growing sense of unease as fascism spread across the continent. Wake worked as a freelance journalist, contributing to European newspapers and building a network of influential contacts among the social elite. She lived a life of parties, luxury, and intellectual stimulation, becoming fluent in French and establishing herself as a fixture in Parisian high society. In 1933, Wake traveled to Vienna on assignment. There, she witnessed the brutal violence of Nazi rallies firsthand. She saw Jewish citizens beaten in the streets, their shops vandalized, their dignity stripped away by uniformed thugs. The experience left an indelible mark on her. She later recalled the moment as the awakening of her political consciousness and the origin of her deep hatred for fascism. Wake returned to Paris and, in 1939, married French industrialist Henri Fiocca. The couple lived comfortably in Marseille, where Henri owned factories and Wake continued her work as a journalist. But the world was changing rapidly. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. By June 1940, France had fallen. German troops marched into Paris, and the French government surrendered. The northern zone of France came under direct German military occupation, while the southern zone was governed by the collaborationist Vichy regime. Wake and her husband remained in Marseille, which fell within the Vichy zone. but their comfortable life was about to be transformed. Despite the dangers, Wake could not remain idle. She began assisting the French resistance almost immediately, using her social connections and her position as the wife of a wealthy industrialist to avoid suspicion. She worked as a courier for the Alliance Intelligence Network, transporting documents, money, and messages between resistance cells. She also helped Allied soldiers and refugees escape occupied France, guiding them along secret routes through the Pyrenees Mountains into neutral Spain. Wake's work required discretion, courage, and an extraordinary ability to lie convincingly under pressure. She was stopped repeatedly at German checkpoints, her papers scrutinized, her luggage searched. Yet time and again she talked her way through with charm, confidence, and an actress's skill for deception. The Gestapo had no idea that the elegant Frenchwoman smiling politely at their officers was one of the most effective resistance operatives in southern France. By 1943, Wake had helped hundreds of people escape. She had delivered critical intelligence to Allied contacts and facilitated the movement of supplies to resistance fighters. Her network grew, and so did her reputation within the underground. But the Gestapo was closing in. They knew someone was operating in Marseille, someone effective and elusive. They called her the White Mouse, a tribute to her ability to slip through their grasp. The French resistance, once fragmented and disorganized, was becoming more coordinated. Wake was now deeply embedded in its operations. While many resisted in small, scattered groups, she had helped establish a network that would grow into one of the most effective in all of France. 1943. London, England. Nancy Wake had narrowly escaped France. The Gestapo had intensified their pursuit, and her husband, Henry Fiocca, had urged her to flee before it was too late. She left Marseille with forged documents, crossed the Pyrenees on foot, and eventually reached Spain. From there, she made her way to Gibraltar and then to Britain. It was the last time she would see her husband. Henri was arrested by the Gestapo shortly after her escape. Despite brutal interrogation and torture, he refused to reveal any information about his wife's activities. He died in custody in October 1943. Wake did not learn of his death until after the war ended. In London, Wake was recruited by the Special Operations Executive, a secret British organization tasked with conducting espionage, sabotage, and reconnaissance in occupied Europe. The SOE was formed in July 1940 to, as Prime Minister Winston Churchill instructed, set Europe ablaze. Its agents operated behind enemy lines, supporting resistance movements, disrupting German supply chains, and gathering intelligence for the Allies. Wake underwent intensive training at SOE facilities scattered across the British countryside. The curriculum was rigorous and dangerous. She learned close-quarters combat, weapons handling, demolition techniques, parachute jumping, Morse code transmission, and the art of living under cover. She trained with British-made explosives, including the No. 36 Mills bomb grenade, a weapon that could destroy vehicles and infrastructure when placed correctly. She also became proficient with the Sten submachine gun, a simple, mass-produced weapon favored by resistance fighters across Europe. The Sten Mark II weighed just over 6 pounds, fired 9mm parabellum rounds at a rate of 550 rounds per minute, and could be disassembled quickly for concealment. Its crude design, with a tubular steel frame and minimal moving parts, made it prone to jamming if not properly maintained, but it was reliable enough for ambushes and close-range combat. The Sten could be produced for less than £3 per unit, making it ideal for mass distribution to resistance forces. Wake also learned to handle the Lee Enfield No. 4 rifle, the standard British infantry weapon. The Lee Enfield was a bolt-action rifle chambered in .303 British caliber with a 10-round detachable box magazine. It was accurate to 600 yards and, in the hands of a trained marksman, could fire 15 aimed shots per minute. Wake trained in marksmanship at outdoor ranges in Scotland, learning to shoot from prone, kneeling, and standing positions. Demolition, Training occupied a significant portion of the curriculum. Wake learned how to calculate the amount of explosive required to destroy various targets: railway tracks, bridges, telegraph poles, and buildings. She practiced placing charges on mock targets, learning the optimal placement for maximum effect. The British-made plastic explosive known as Composition C could be molded like putty and was remarkably stable, resistant to shock and temperature changes. A 2-pound charge, properly placed, could derail a locomotive. Wake excelled in her training. Her instructors noted her physical toughness, her quick thinking under pressure, and her ability to remain calm in dangerous situations. She was also taught how to use wireless radio equipment, including the Listen Type B Mark II radio, which allowed SOE agents to communicate with London from occupied territory. These radios were compact but powerful, capable of transmitting encrypted messages across hundreds of miles. By early 1944, Wake had completed her training. She was assigned the code name Hélène and given her orders: parachute into the Auvergne region of central France, link up with local Maquis resistance groups, and organize them into an effective fighting force. Her mission was to prepare the resistance for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, planned for June 6, 1944. She was trained to become the very weapon that could disrupt the German war machine with techniques that would challenge even the most seasoned Nazi forces. April 29, 1944. The skies over central France. Nancy Wake sat in the cold belly of a Royal Air Force Handley Page Halifax bomber, waiting for the green light. Below, the French countryside lay dark and silent. Somewhere down there, resistance fighters were waiting for her arrival, marking a drop zone with dim flashlights. The light flashed green. Wake jumped, the parachute deployed with a violent jerk, and she descended into the night. She landed hard in a field, bruising her tailbone, but quickly gathered her parachute and equipment. Within minutes, she had made contact with the reception committee, members of the local Maquis, who would become her comrades in the months ahead. The Maquis were irregular resistance fighters who operated primarily in rural areas, conducting guerrilla warfare against German occupation forces. The term Maquis referred to the dense, scrubby vegetation of the Mediterranean hills, where early resistance groups hid. By 1944, Maquis groups had spread throughout France, numbering tens of thousands of fighters. Wake's assigned group operated in the Auvergne region, a mountainous and heavily forested area ideal for guerrilla operations. The local commander was Captain Henri Tardevat, a former French Army officer. Under his leadership and with Wake's coordination, the group began organizing sabotage missions against German infrastructure. One of Wake's first objectives was to disrupt the railway line between Bordeaux and Toulouse, a critical supply route for German forces. The Maquis teams she coordinated used improvised explosive devices constructed from British-supplied plastic explosives. These charges were placed on rail tracks under cover of darkness, timed to detonate as German supply trains passed. The results were immediate and devastating. On May 12, 1944, a German ammunition train derailed near Montauban, destroying 15 freight cars loaded with artillery shells and small arms ammunition. On May 18th, another attack derailed a troop transport carrying reinforcements toward the Atlantic coast. Dozens of German soldiers were killed, and the line was closed for 3 days while repairs were made. Wake also coordinated attacks on German supply depots and communication facilities. On June 1, 1944, just days before the Normandy invasion, Maquis fighters under her direction attacked a German fuel depot near Montluçon, destroying over 30,000 liters of diesel fuel and gasoline. The depot had been stockpiled for German motorized units preparing to respond to an Allied landing. Her ability to remain undetected by the Gestapo earned her the nickname the White Mouse among both the resistance and the Germans. She moved constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice, always one step ahead of German patrols. She dressed as a local peasant, spoke fluent French, and had an uncanny ability to sense danger before it arrived. Wake's operations were supported by regular supply drops from the Royal Air Force. British aircraft flew night missions over occupied France, dropping containers filled with weapons, explosives, ammunition, and equipment. Wake coordinated these drops, ensuring that the supplies reached the right resistance groups and were distributed efficiently. By early June 1944, Wake's network controlled over 7,000 resistance fighters across the Auvergne region. They had conducted dozens of successful sabotage missions, killed or captured hundreds of German soldiers, and disrupted German logistics at a critical moment. The sabotage she orchestrated helped delay vital German shipments to the front lines, preventing reinforcements from reaching Normandy during the critical days before D-Day. May 1944. Vichy, France. Gestapo headquarters. A grainy photograph lay on the desk of Sturmbannführer Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief in Lyon, known as the Butcher of Lyon. The photograph showed a woman in her early 30s, dark-haired, elegantly dressed, smiling at the camera. Beneath the photo, a typewritten dossier listed her known aliases, associates, and suspected operations. Her name was Nancy Wake. The Gestapo had placed a bounty of 5 million francs on her head, the highest reward offered for any resistance operative in France. The sum was equivalent to over 150,000 British pounds. At the time, an extraordinary amount that reflected both the danger she posed and the frustration she caused. The Gestapo had been hunting Wake since 1943, when intelligence reports first identified her as a key figure in the Alliance resistance network. Informants had provided fragmentary information. A woman with dark hair, French accent, married to an industrialist in Marseille. But every time German agents closed in, she disappeared. The Gestapo compiled thick dossiers on suspected resistance members, cross-referencing witness statements, intercepted communications, and surveillance reports. Wake's name appeared repeatedly, always connected to successful operations, always just out of reach. The Gestapo employed sophisticated surveillance techniques. They monitored railway stations, photographed travelers at checkpoints, and infiltrated resistance networks with informants and double agents. They analyzed patterns of movement, looking for individuals who traveled frequently between cities, who had no apparent occupation, who associated with known resistance members. Wake fit the profile, but she was careful, disciplined, and lucky. In December 1943, Gestapo officers raided her apartment in Marseille. They arrived at dawn, surrounding the building with armed men. They found it empty. Wake had fled days earlier, warned by a contact within the Vichy police. The Gestapo arrested her husband, Henri Fiocca, and subjected him to weeks of brutal interrogation. They broke his fingers with hammers, burned him with cigarettes, beat him unconscious multiple times, and threatened to kill him if he did not reveal his wife's whereabouts. He revealed nothing. His silence bought Wake time to escape France. By mid-1944, Wake was operating deep in occupied territory, coordinating Maquis operations from hidden camps in the Auvergne forests. German forces launched repeated sweeps through the region, searching for resistance bases. Wake moved constantly, sleeping in barns, farmhouses, and forest clearings. She traveled by bicycle, covering over 200 kilometers in a single night on one occasion to deliver critical intelligence. The Gestapo intensified their efforts. They deployed additional officers to the region, established new checkpoints, and offered substantial rewards to informants. Wake's photograph appeared on wanted posters in towns and villages across southern France. German soldiers carried copies of her picture, comparing it to the faces of women they stopped at roadblocks. Yet she continued to evade them. Her fluency in French, her ability to adopt local accents, and her quick thinking under pressure allowed her to pass through checkpoint after checkpoint. On one occasion, German soldiers searched the truck she was riding in, unaware that she was hiding weapons beneath bags of vegetables. She smiled at the soldiers, chatted pleasantly about the weather, and was waved through. On another occasion, Wake narrowly escaped a Gestapo raid on a safe house in Montluçon. She had been meeting with local resistance leaders when a lookout spotted German vehicles approaching. Wake fled through a back window, crossed a neighbor's garden, and disappeared into a crowded market square. The Gestapo arrested 3 resistance members in the raid, but Wake was gone. The Gestapo's belief that they would capture Wake quickly was shattered by her uncanny ability to disappear without a trace. June 1944. Auvergne region, France. Nancy Wake had become the de facto commander of over 7,000 Maquis fighters scattered across central France. Her role extended far beyond simple coordination. She managed logistics, planned operations, resolved disputes between rival resistance groups, and maintained communication with British Special Operations Executive Headquarters in London. The Maquis groups under her command varied widely in size, capability, and discipline. Some were well-organized units led by former French Army officers. Others were collections of farmers, factory workers, and young men fleeing forced labor conscription. Wake worked tirelessly to train them, equip them, and mold them into an effective fighting force. She organized weapons training sessions, teaching men who had never fired a gun how to use the Sten submachine gun, the Lee Enfield rifle, and the Bren light machine gun. She demonstrated how to place explosive charges on bridges, railway tracks, and fuel depots. She taught them the basics of small unit tactics, ambush techniques, and how to fade into the countryside before German reinforcements arrived. Many of these men were farmers, shopkeepers, or factory workers with no military experience. Wake transformed them into disciplined fighters capable of executing complex operations. Training was conducted in remote forest clearings, away from German patrols. Wake insisted on strict discipline. Fighters learned to move silently through woods, to communicate with hand signals, to take cover effectively. They practiced assembling and disassembling weapons blindfolded, a skill essential for nighttime operations. They learned to estimate distances, compensate for wind when shooting, and conserve ammunition by firing only when certain of hitting their target. Wake also managed the distribution of supplies dropped by the Royal Air Force. Between April and August 1944, RAF bombers delivered over 200 tons of equipment to resistance groups in the Auvergne region. The drops included Sten guns, Lee Enfield rifles, Bren guns, plastic explosives, grenades, ammunition, radios, medical supplies, and clothing. Each container weighed approximately 300 pounds and was dropped with parachutes from altitudes of 500 to 1,000 feet. Each supply drop required precise coordination. Wake had to select a suitable drop zone, far from German garrisons, but accessible to resistance fighters. The zone needed to be flat enough for parachutes to land safely, large enough to accommodate multiple containers, and remote enough to avoid detection. She had to arrange for reception committees to mark the zone with lights arranged in specific patterns that pilots could recognize from the air. The containers had to be recovered before dawn and the supplies distributed quickly. German patrols often investigated drop zones within hours of a delivery, so speed and secrecy were essential. On several occasions, Maquis teams recovered containers while German search parties were less than a kilometer away. Under Wake's leadership, the Maquis conducted increasingly ambitious operations. On June 10, 1944, 4 days after the Normandy landings, a Maquis unit ambushed a German convoy near Chaude-Aigle, destroying 6 trucks and killing 22 soldiers. On June 15th, another unit attacked a German barracks near Saint-Flour, setting fire to the building and forcing the garrison to evacuate. Wake also coordinated attacks on German communication lines. Resistance teams cut telephone wires, destroyed telegraph stations, and sabotaged radio relay towers. These attacks disrupted German efforts to coordinate their response to the Allied invasion, delaying the movement of reinforcements toward Normandy. The German response was brutal. Wehrmacht and SS units conducted sweeps through the countryside, burning villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters. Civilians caught aiding the Maquis were executed on the spot. Wake witnessed these reprisals firsthand and was forced to make difficult decisions about when to engage German forces and when to retreat to avoid civilian casualties. Despite the dangers, the Maquis continued to grow. By July 1944, Wake's network had expanded to include over 10,000 fighters. They controlled large swaths of rural central France, establishing zones where German forces ventured only in large, heavily armed convoys. Wake's leadership turned small, isolated cells into a formidable force, capable of challenging the German occupation head-on. June 6, 1944. Normandy coast, France. Shortly after midnight, Allied paratroopers began dropping into the darkness behind German coastal defenses. At dawn, thousands of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. Operation Overlord, the long-awaited liberation of Western Europe, had begun. Hundreds of kilometers to the south, Nancy Wake and the Maquis sprang into action. Their mission was clear: prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy. Every bridge destroyed, every railway line sabotaged, every German convoy ambushed would buy the Allied forces more time to establish their beachhead. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, Wake had received detailed instructions from SOE headquarters. Resistance groups across France were ordered to implement Plan Vert, a coordinated sabotage campaign targeting German rail transport. The plan aimed to paralyze the French railway system, making it impossible for Germany to move armored divisions and infantry regiments quickly to the invasion zone. Wake's Maquis groups executed their assignments with precision. On the night of June 5th, just hours before the invasion began, resistance teams attacked railway lines across central France. Explosives destroyed tracks, signal boxes, and switching stations. German repair crews worked frantically to restore service, but each time they repaired one section, another attack occurred elsewhere. The results were measurable. The German 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, stationed near Toulouse, received orders to move north to Normandy on June 8th. Under normal circumstances, the division could have reached the invasion zone by train in 2 to 3 days. Instead, forced to travel by road due to sabotaged rail lines and harassed constantly by Maquis ambushes, the division took 17 days to reach Normandy. By the time it arrived, the Allied beachhead was firmly established. Wake's forces also targeted German communication infrastructure. Telephone lines were cut, radio stations destroyed, and messengers ambushed. German commanders struggled to coordinate their units, often relying on motorcycle couriers who were vulnerable to Maquis attacks. On June 20th, a Maquis unit under Wake's command ambushed a German supply convoy near Brioude. The convoy consisted of 12 trucks carrying ammunition, fuel, and rations destined for German forces in Normandy. The Maquis destroyed all 12 trucks and killed or captured 38 German soldiers. None of the supplies reached their destination. The impact of these operations extended beyond immediate tactical gains. German forces were forced to divert troops from the front lines to secure rear areas. Instead of fighting Allied soldiers in Normandy, German battalions were assigned to guard railways, patrol roads, and hunt resistance fighters in the French countryside. Wake maintained regular radio contact with London throughout this period, reporting on German troop movements, successful sabotage operations, and requesting additional supplies. Her intelligence reports provided Allied commanders with valuable information about German strength and dispositions in central France. The disruption caused by Wake's operations in the days leading up to D-Day directly impacted the success of the Allied landings. June 20th, 1944. Montmouche Plateau, Auvergne. Over 3,000 Maquis fighters had assembled on the high plateau, transforming it into a fortified resistance stronghold. The plateau offered excellent defensive terrain, steep slopes, dense forests, and clear sight lines. The Maquis dug trenches, established observation posts, and prepared to defend their position against German attack. Nancy Wake was present at Montmouchet coordinating logistics and communications. She had argued against concentrating so many fighters in one location, warning that it would invite a major German offensive. Her concerns proved correct. German commanders, infuriated by the resistance's growing audacity, decided to crush the Montmouchet stronghold with overwhelming force. On June 20th, German forces launched their assault. The attacking force consisted of elements from 3 Wehrmacht divisions, reinforced by SS troops and supported by artillery and aircraft. The Germans deployed over 10,000 soldiers, along with mortars, machine guns, and armored vehicles. The Maquis defenders were outnumbered more than 3-1 and outgunned in every respect. They possessed primarily small arms, Sten guns, Lee Enfield rifles, and a handful of Bren light machine guns. They had no artillery, no air support, and limited ammunition. Against German mortars and machine guns, their position was untenable. The battle lasted 3 days. Maquis fighters held their positions with extraordinary courage, repelling initial German attacks and inflicting significant casualties. German infantry advancing up the slopes were met with rifle fire from concealed positions. Bren gunners targeted German officers and machine gun crews. Explosive charges detonated under advancing vehicles, but the disparity in firepower was overwhelming. German mortars systematically destroyed Maquis' defensive positions, walking their fire across the plateau, collapsing trenches and bunkers. Luftwaffe aircraft strafed the plateau with machine gun fire and dropped fragmentation bombs. Ammunition ran low, casualties mounted, wounded fighters lay in makeshift field hospitals with inadequate medical supplies. On June 22nd, after 3 days of continuous combat, German forces broke through the Maquis defensive line on the eastern edge of the plateau. SS troops poured through the breach, flanking the defenders and forcing them to abandon their positions. The plateau descended into chaos as resistance fighters attempted to withdraw through the forests. Some units retreated in good order, covering each other's withdrawal and maintaining formation. Others broke and scattered, individuals and small groups fleeing independently. German troops swept through the plateau, methodically searching trenches and bunkers, killing wounded fighters who could not escape and burning supply dumps to deny them to the resistance. Wake escaped the encirclement by leading a small group through the forests surrounding the plateau. They moved through the night, navigating by stars, avoiding German patrols. By dawn on June 23rd, they had reached a safe house 15 kilometers away. Over 200 Maquis fighters were killed at Montmouchet, and hundreds more were captured. The defeat was devastating, but not total. Most of the Maquis fighters escaped, and within days, Wake began reorganizing them. The battle demonstrated the limitations of conventional defense for irregular forces, but it also showed that the resistance could not be easily eliminated. Despite the heavy losses suffered by the Maquis, the Germans failed to fully neutralize the resistance, and Wake's escape from the battle proved her resilience. July through September 1944, Central France. Nancy Wake continued leading Maquis operations long after the Normandy landings. As Allied forces advanced across France, the resistance's role evolved from sabotage and harassment to direct support of military operations. Wake coordinated intelligence-gathering missions, providing Allied commanders with information about German defensive positions, troop strength, and supply routes. Maquis scouts observed German movements and reported back via radio, helping Allied forces plan their advances and avoid ambushes. In August 1944, as Allied forces approached central France, Wake's Maquis groups intensified their attacks. They ambushed German convoys attempting to retreat eastward, captured isolated garrisons, and liberated towns and villages ahead of the advancing Allies. On August 25th, Paris was liberated. By early September, most of France was free. Wake's final major operation occurred in September 1944, when her Maquis units assisted in the liberation of Vichy. The city, which had served as the capital of the collaborationist French government, fell with minimal resistance. Wake personally arrested several Vichy officials who had collaborated with the Germans. By October 1944, the war in France was effectively over. German forces had been pushed back to the borders of Germany. Wake returned to Britain, exhausted, grief-stricken by the death of her husband, but proud of what the resistance had achieved. Despite the liberation of France, Wake's actions continued to destabilize German operations until the very end of the war. October 1944, London, England. Nancy Wake arrived in Britain a hero, though she did not yet know it. She had spent months in occupied France, living in constant danger, sleeping in barns and forest camps, subsisting on black bread and whatever food the Maquis could scavenge. She was thin, exhausted, and emotionally drained. The Special Operations Executive debriefed her extensively, recording her accounts of operations, casualties, and lessons learned. Her reports contributed to the SOE's understanding of resistance warfare and influenced British support for underground movements in other occupied territories. It was in London that Wake learned of her husband's death. Henry Fiocca had been arrested by the Gestapo in late 1943 and died under torture in October of that year. He had never revealed her identity or her activities. The news devastated Wake, leaving her with profound guilt that she had escaped while he had paid the ultimate price. In recognition of her service, Wake received numerous honors from multiple governments. The British government awarded her the II George Medal, one of the highest civilian decorations for gallantry. The French government awarded her the Croix de Guerre with 2 palms, the Médaille de la Résistance, and made her a Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur. The United States awarded her the Medal of Freedom with bronze palm. These honors reflected not only her personal courage, but also the recognition that her operations had made a measurable difference to the Allied war effort. Her sabotage missions delayed German reinforcements at critical moments. Her intelligence reports provided valuable information to Allied commanders. Her leadership transformed scattered resistance groups into an effective military force. Her escape from France marked the end of one chapter, but it set the stage for her recognition as one of the war's greatest female heroes. 1945 through 1985. Australia, Britain, and France. After the war ended, Nancy Wake struggled to find her place in a world at peace. She had lived on adrenaline and danger for years. She had made life-and-death decisions, commanded thousands of men, and survived situations that killed many of her comrades. Civilian life felt empty by comparison. The routines of ordinary existence seemed trivial after the intensity of wartime operations. She returned to Australia in 1949 and attempted to build a new life. The country had changed during the war years, grown more prosperous, more confident, more connected to the wider world. But Wake found herself unable to relate to the concerns of her fellow Australians. She worked briefly in the intelligence services, applying her wartime experience to Cold War operations, but found the bureaucracy stifling and the work unfulfilling. She married British pilot John Forward in 1957. Forward had served in the Royal Air Force during the war, flying bombers over Germany. He understood something of Wake's experiences, but the marriage was troubled. Wake struggled with depression, nightmares, and survivor's guilt. Forward tried to support her, but he had his own demons from the war. Wake entered politics briefly, running as a Liberal candidate in the 1951 federal election. She campaigned on her wartime record, but Australian voters were unimpressed. She lost the election decisively. The experience left her disillusioned with democratic politics. She moved to Britain in the 1970s and later returned to Australia. She lived modestly, refusing to capitalize on her wartime fame. She gave occasional interviews to historians and journalists, but she avoided publicity and declined offers to write her memoirs for many years. In 1985, she finally agreed to cooperate with author Russell Braddon, who wrote her biography. The book brought her story to a wider audience and sparked renewed interest in her wartime service. In 1988, a television miniseries based on her life aired in Australia, introducing her to a new generation. Despite her fame in the resistance, she remained humble, never seeking attention. Post-war analysis. Global perspective. Historians and military analysts have debated the strategic impact of resistance movements during World War II. Some argue that the contribution of guerrilla forces was minimal compared to conventional military operations. Others maintain that resistance movements played a crucial role in weakening Axis powers and supporting Allied victories. Nancy Wake's operations provide a clear case study. Her sabotage missions directly delayed German military units during the critical days following the Normandy invasion. The 2nd SS Panzer Division des Reich, which should have reached the invasion zone within 3 days, took 17 days due to sabotaged railways and Maquis ambushes. Those 2 weeks allowed Allied forces to consolidate their beachhead and prepare for the German counterattack. The effectiveness of Wake's missions was measurable. German forces were delayed by weeks due to her actions, altering the course of battles in Normandy. Wake's intelligence reports also provided valuable information to Allied commanders. She reported on German troop movements, identified supply routes, and assessed the strength of German garrisons. This information helped Allied planners target airstrikes, plan ground offensives, and avoid German strong points. Beyond the tactical and strategic impacts, Wake's service demonstrated the crucial role that women could play in wartime operations. She operated in a domain traditionally dominated by men, leading thousands of male fighters, coordinating complex military operations, and earning the respect of soldiers and officers alike. Her success challenged contemporary assumptions about gender roles and capabilities. 2001 through 2011. London, England. Nancy Wake spent her final years in London, living in a hotel room at the Stafford Hotel in Mayfair. She had no close family, few visitors, and limited financial resources despite her wartime heroism. She reflected often on the war, on the people she had lost, and on the price of resistance. She spoke candidly about killing German soldiers, expressing no remorse, but also no pride. It had been necessary, she said. She had done what needed to be done. Wake died on August 7, 2011, at the age of 98. Her ashes were scattered in the hills of Montluçon, France, near the areas where she had operated during the war. The French government honored her with a state funeral, attended by dignitaries and veterans. Her work in the resistance was crucial, but she never sought fame, instead reflecting on the personal toll of leadership during wartime. Nancy Wake's legacy extends beyond her wartime exploits. She became a symbol of courage, resilience, and the capacity of individuals to resist tyranny. Her story has been told in books, films, and documentaries, inspiring generations of people around the world. Her service challenged conventional assumptions about warfare and gender. She proved that women could operate effectively in combat roles, lead military units, and make life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure. Her success opened doors for future generations of women in military and intelligence services. Wake's operations also illustrated the strategic importance of resistance movements. Her sabotage missions disrupted German logistics at critical moments. Her intelligence reports provided valuable information to Allied commanders. Her leadership transformed scattered resistance groups into effective military forces. These contributions, multiplied across dozens of SOE agents and thousands of resistance fighters, played a measurable role in the Allied victory. Yet Wake herself remained ambivalent about her wartime service. She acknowledged the necessity of her actions, but derived no pleasure from them. She had killed, she said, because it was required. She had led others into danger because it was necessary. She had survived when many others had not, and that survival carried a burden of memory and loss. Her defiance against the Nazi Empire changed the course of history, showing that one individual could make all the difference in the fight for freedom. In the end, Nancy Wake's story is not one of glory or adventure, but of duty, sacrifice, and the quiet courage of those who resist oppression. She did what was necessary without hesitation and without expectation of reward. She paid a terrible price for her service, losing her husband, her home, and years of her life to war. Yet she never regretted her choice. She had fought for freedom, and freedom had been won. That, she believed, was enough.